Okay, well, hopefully this is recording and we are good to go. Thank you for tuning into our video really quick like here. I'll try to get through this without too much ado, and you will see that there are links to a few articles underneath. They'll also be in the video. You'll also see a bunch of references that I've listed right there for what I'm going to talk about. So please feel free to check that out as well. What I'd like to talk about today, just as some background for the discussion, is what we mean by academic integrity. And I'd like to provide a framework for actually considering what we mean by academic integrity and how it's usually operationalized. So let's jump into this here. To start with, I'd just like to think about this. What is academic integrity? To you, what does this mean? Just ask yourself the question, think of a very brief answer. What is academic integrity? What does that mean? You pause the video while you're doing it and write it down, or, keep it in mind for later if you want to. Next up, here's a bit of a twist. What is a violation of academic integrity? So, slight change. I'd like you to think of three things that would actually count as violations of academic integrity. And write them down just like I said before, or, alternately, just keep them in mind if you think you can do that. I'd like you to consider what you said in the previous case, too. What is academic integrity? Uh, your answer right there. Was it about something that you are supposed to do? Was it a concept, or was it something you're supposed to not do? And how does that compare to what you say with a violation of academic integrity here? Anyhow, three things that you can think of. Pause the video, write them down, or again, keep them in mind. And hopefully you've got them. So now let's move on to the next part. I will proceed to read your mind. So let's think about this. All right, what is academic integrity? My guess is you probably said something like not cheating, not falsifying, not lying about things. Probably something like that. So defined not as something that you maintain, but rather something you don't do. Was that pretty close? Yes, no? Yeah, I don't know. We're not talking to each other right now. So if there's something I missed, if I was wrong, write that down so we can talk about it later. Okay, next up. What is an academic integrity violation? I asked you to think of three things. Well, my guess is the first one was probably plagiarism. Maybe that wasn't the first one. Maybe your first one was instead cheating on a test or a paper. But my guess is your first two were probably those plagiarism plus cheating on a test or a paper. The third one, I don't know. But my guess is it was something like, writing someone else's paper for them or just breaking the rules somehow. That's my guess. I don't know how correct I am or not, but I can tell you that the bulk of the research literature out there would basically talk about those things. So, what does this mean? Well, now I get to use my favorite dad joke, which is what do you get when you cross an elephant with a rhino? Elephino. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, well, I'm a new dad. What can I tell you? Anyhow, I'd like you to think about this, though. The answers that you were just considering, the things we were just talking about, um, what do they say about power structures? When someone asks, what is academic integrity? And you say, oh, well, it's not cheating, and it's not cheating on a test, it's not having someone else write your paper. Okay, who does that definition apply to? Is that something that is for everybody? Or is that specific to one group or a particular set of groups of people? What does it say about who's responsible for maintaining academic integrity? Is this something that everybody is supposed to do with one another? Is it supposed to be an individual thing? Is it supposed to be certain groups of people who are constantly watching others? Also, what does it imply about who or what is not responsible? Who exactly does not have to think about this stuff? Is there somebody that really doesn't figure into our thoughts here? When you say don't cheat on a test, does that apply to professors? Does that apply to common people out there in general? Or does it really just focus in on students? Think about the examples that you were thinking of academic integrity. Violations. Who commits them? Or what commits them? My guess is you probably said things like cheating on papers or tests. Okay. What about fraudulently receiving federal government funds for students? What about convincing people who really have no business registering for classes that they really should, just so that you can get some extra Pell Grant money? Who do we target with the examples that we've created here? These are the things that we really need to think about. What do these say about power structures? Going back to our definitions and what we think of when we say academic integrity. Okay, well, let's think about this. I'm kind of just guessing here, obviously, because we're not talking to one another, but from the answers that I get from a lot of people, they usually focus on individual actions, not necessarily even small groups of individuals. Mostly it's focused on the individual and what individual people do. It's this single people cheat and they're responsible for cheating. Probably focused on student actions as problematic. Oh, these are bad things that students do, and we need to monitor them and fix them. And probably things that students do in schooling, not necessarily outside, but specifically actions inside a classroom. And we're going to take a look more at another look at that in a little bit here in a slightly different light. So there's some implications to the kind of common answers we get here. It's that integrity, as I said, is something that applies to individuals, and individuals have to maintain it. Integrity is mostly something that's focused on students and their actions above all else. Students have to be monitored, they have to be surveilled and supervised. But the big thing here is what about everyone else? Who else can be guilty of an academic integrity violation? Who else is responsible for maintaining academic integrity? So, with this in mind, I'd like to consider this. There are some particular ways that the research gets framed and the way that it gets reported. And when we have these particular framings of the research, what can happen is we can really end up siloed and we can get a very skewed perspective on things. Now, there's four big research trends that have really applied to academic integrity and academic integrity violations over the past, let's call it 50 or 60 years, though there are more developing right now. One is the cheating and specifically academic integrity perspective. This really comes from Bill Bower's original 1964 study of higher education in the United States and how many students had committed what he identified as 11 behaviors that are academic integrity violations. Donald McCabe at the business school at Rutgers took this up in the 1990s and continued doing the same sorts of surveys that Bowers had done. Um, did them all the way up until he passed away about 7 years ago. And there is a new version of this survey that's coming out this year, which basically says, we've picked about 20 or so academic integrity violations that we think are representative, and we want to see how many people are actually doing them. They're exclusively focused on students. They don't ask any questions about anything else, just what students do. There's another field of research that really touches on this, which is plagiarism. There are a lot of different fields that look at plagiarism. If you type that in any kind of Google Scholar search or anything else, you're going to find gobs of research out there. Lots of stuff from ESL, EFL, lots of stuff from rhetoric and English, lots of stuff now from computer science as well, people stealing each other's code and using it. Um, and the big focus in this research area is how much plagiarism is going on. How do we detect it? How can we find out when people have plagiarized? And how can we prevent this plagiarism through effective detection and punishment? It's always really about that, detecting and punishing. Now, there's a smaller piece of this research area that's focused on plagiarism as a developmental stage, particularly in second language learning. So, uh, Alistair Pennycook, particularly, along with Pecorari, both of them have focused a lot on how what can be considered plagiarism in one context is actually a developmental stage as we learn how to write or, do computer code, as it were. And that we can't necessarily be super harsh in just saying detect and punish, detect and punish. Instead, we might need to treat it as a teachable moment. But that is by far a minority of the research out there. Another one is research fraud. This is very much separate. You will not find the people who talk about research fraud really talking about academic integrity ever. They'll only talk about fraud in research. This is more of a gray area right now. It's not necessarily a huge research area, although it is coming up in the world. Retraction Watch by a guy named Ivan Aransky, who's a journalist, is probably the most cited resource in regards to research fraud right now. But there are two people who are up and coming. One is Elizabeth Bick, whose Twitter account is legendary right now. She is probably the cutting edge of all sorts of detection in terms of scientific misconduct, particularly in terms of image manipulation and data manipulation. Leonid Schneider being the other one. They both know each other and have worked together a few times. Um, they focus really on statistical anomalies and, like I said, image manipulation and how people use them when they are trying to falsify results and get fake research out there. There's also some work that's gone on in fake citation networks, essay mills for researchers, all these sorts of things. And last but not least, there is some experimental work that's been done in the field of psychology and also in the field of social psychology that looks at lying and misrepresentation, deception, why people do this, how they engage in it, and what it really means. Particularly, how you can find out that someone's lying. How can you detect that somebody is lying? And also, to a lesser extent, what conditions are present when lying takes place. Okay, well, those are four areas right there. There's a bit that's missing, though. First, I want to start with some commonalities. So, the things we see in quotation marks here. We gotta catch the cheaters. That's almost universal. Whenever you talk about academic integrity violations, academic integrity, cheating, etc., there's always this focus on how do you catch the cheaters. That's just kind of the popular trope out there, as it were. Paul Ekman's work is probably the most representative right here. He was a psychologist that really focused in on how to catch people cheating very quickly, how to make snap social judgments based on limited data and have them be super accurate. He was the inspiration behind the main character in Lie to Me, which was a little, I guess, drama series on one of the popular TV networks a while back. Um, but there's also a huge focus in computer science right now about how to create the perfect algorithm to detect all types of plagiarism and cheating out there. There's also this commonality, which is we got to prevent them from cheating, which really turns into what's the most effective punishment for cheaters. Um, there's not a ton of this going on with research fraud, though. It's mostly we've got to catch the cheaters in research fraud. Elizabeth Bick's work is probably the only one right now that's focused on trying to prevent people from cheating. And again, in her case, it's through detection. And finally, there's this we got to find out why cheaters cheat. And it's not necessarily even why so much as how. How are they cheating out there? What's going on? Why are they doing it is it's part of it, but it's not huge. And one big thing that's missing from the why is why exactly does cheating happen rather than why do cheaters cheat? So the two big things that are missing are what are the social conditions? Where are they? Where are the institutions? Where is institutional responsibility in all this? Why is it that cheating is always framed as such an individual act? We got to look beyond the individual when we consider these things. We have to consider the social conditions that promote cheating, like I mentioned before. We have to think about the institutional conditions that promote cheating. So, to put both of those in perspective, if everyone else around you is cheating, what are you going to do? Think about this. How many people actually drive the speed limit on the Beltway? If you're the only person driving the speed limit and everybody else is going faster, what does that make you? How are people going to perceive you? Institutional conditions, of course. This is quite simple. If an institution says you have to pass this one test, this one definitive test, if you pass it, okay, you can continue on with your life. But if you fail it, oh, you're never going to get ahead in life. Life is going to be terrible, and you've just got this one chance, this one shot. Eminem starts playing in the background, dun, 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 and we start talking about mom's spaghetti right there. Um, in that situation, of course, people are going to cheat. It's well documented and it's been well known through history. And in those situations, no matter what the punishment is, the institutional conditions, just saying that you have to do this and you've got one shot, they mean that there's more riding on that one thing and is to your benefit to try to cheat and pass rather than simply say, oh, I'm going to be honest and maybe not pass. Institutional actions can promote cheating too. We are actually involved in one right now. Universities throughout the world have now all of a sudden just switched over to being in an online format with very little in the way of planning for how to do that. So that right there creates confusion and means that people are going to try to do whatever feels most secure in order to actually survive this term. In particular, there are a lot of professors right now, and even in entire departments, that have started saying things like students must wear appropriate clothing to Zoom sessions, students must be exactly on time to Zoom sessions, we will not allow any extraneous noise, and you can be punished for that. Well, as soon as you start doing something like that, people are going to say, this is too much, I can't deal with it. And that's when you're going to start seeing people do what they actively are doing, which is creating Python scripts to make it look like they're attending class when they're not. There's an interesting part of this too, which is that institutions are usually immune to accusations of cheating. So think of it like this. Let's put the uh, example down underneath here. Traditionally, courts have not really wanted to interfere with higher education, particularly in the United States, but worldwide as well. Whatever a school chooses to do, that's its choice, and we're not going to interfere with it. But think about how for profit universities tend to go after federal funding. This is well documented. Tressie McMillan Cotton has done a lot of work looking at this. I would encourage you to look at I believe any of her work that's focused on the for profit college industry and how it tends to try to get federal funds uh, funneled straight into the universities uh, by basically making promises to people about degrees that they could never get. So I would propose this as a basic framework that we can use to consider academic integrity violations. All these things that I've been talking about, I'd invite you, whenever you're thinking about a violation here of academic integrity, anytime somebody talks about cheating, anytime somebody talks about plagiarism, etc., I'd like you to consider four big things. The first is target. When we talk about this particular action, who's the target of this particular judgment? Whenever I say plagiarism, all right, who are we targeting with this idea here of plagiarism? Who does it? What exactly are we talking about here? I'd invite you to think about the monitor. Who exactly is seen as responsible for finding these particular violations and reporting them, for actually documenting them? Who's actually out there trying to say, like, well, what happened? Uh, the next one is protecting. Who exactly is responsible for making sure that violations are not happening? So, to take the plagiarism example, whose responsibility is it to make sure that plagiarism does not take place? Think about the class that you're in right now. Who's supposed to be monitoring that? Are you, as the instructor, the professor? Is it a computer program? Who's doing it? And finally, punish. I say punish because that's the most common action, but, really it should just be acting. Who or what is responsible for acting on violations? What happens in that case? Now, the other big thing for all four of these areas is who or what is not for each of these. What exactly is not there? Who's missing from this? When we consider all the participants in a particular action or a particular situation, who is not there when we talk about each of these aspects? So, for example, if we're talking about plagiarism, oh, a student plagiarized. Okay, well, the target right there quite clearly is a student. Um, when that happens, though, a student doesn't just plagiarize on his or her or their own. Um, it happens in a particular context. What was the class? What was the professor doing? Was this a good assignment? What kind of institution are they attending? What language are they speaking? All of these things, all of them would go into the context. So even if we just think about the basic ones of who are the people and what's the institution, who's not being targeted when we talk about plagiarism? If you say a student plagiarized, well, is the institution encouraging them to do that? Is the institution, in fact, enforcing that particular set of circumstances? Um, just keep that in mind. So, target, monitor, protect, and punish. A couple areas that we can, not a couple, but four rather, areas that we can think of with this. So, I wanted to look at a few examples here. Please feel free to skip along right here. I know I've been babbling a lot, so I have four examples. Take a look at any or all of them as you see fit to do. First one, study drugs. Probably didn't think about this one now, did you? But, you know, there are a lot of people out there who try to use things like Ritalin, Adderall, whatever else it might be, to gain an advantage when it comes to studying, taking tests, etc., being able to deal with all the coursework that you're dealing with and maybe work at the same time, whatever it might be. There's a recent article out of Australia by Dunn et al. That really looks at this and looks at professors' judgments of, is this actually an academic integrity violation? Um, this is something with a long history, but it's oftentimes seen as a health problem more than any kind of academic integrity problem. And in fact, that's borne out by most of the interviews that Dunn et al. Did. Professors were reluctant to say, oh, yeah, that's an example of cheating. But these are the same professors who would very clearly say, oh, if you got some extra studying help when I told you not to do it, that's definitely cheating. But if you say, yeah, that extra studying help was I took a drug that helps me study, they would probably say, well, that's not here nor there. Um, Interestingly, here at the University of Maryland, the definition of cheating in our Code of Academic Integrity is the whole definition's right here, but I'm just going to read the last part. Using or attempting to use unauthorized materials, information, or study aids in any academic course or exercise. Under this definition, using a particular drug to gain an advantage over other people in terms of being able to perform well on a test or in courses, that would be a violation of the Code of Academic Integrity. The interesting thing right here, though, is when we talk about this, I would ask you to consider the particular areas that we looked at before. Once again, study drugs, who's being targeted by any talk about study drugs, who's monitoring them, who's supposed to be protecting us and making sure that this doesn't happen, and who's supposed to be acting on violations of this. So I've got a link to an article right there. I invite you to take a look at it and consider those questions right there when you think about the context. How is the issue framed, and what does that tell us about it? Next up, the computer science cheating epidemic. This is an ongoing issue, and particularly at the University of Maryland, computer science accounts for about half of all academic integrity violations at this school. Wah, 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 wah. Last year, out of about 700 cases, roughly 350 of them were from computer science. Uh, that's huge. So I've got a couple of links right there talking about how people consider this stuff, what they think about it, just for you to take a look at and think about how this is being framed. They're both from Reddit, which means that it's going to be skewed. It's not representative of everyone, of course. Um, but to be fair, computer science itself is very, very heavily skewed to be male. It's about 80% male, and it's very heavily white folks, though there's an increasing number of international students in there as well. People in computer science tend to think, well, we just got to catch people. If we can create the right algorithm, then we're going to be able to catch everybody. And hey, you know what? We could even turn that into a program that we could sell to universities. And hey, we could make some money right there. But there's another piece to this, which is that a lot of the issues that we come up with in computer science are in basic level courses, 100 level courses, in some cases 300 level courses, but they're all considered gateway courses. These are the ones that you have to pass in order to be fully accepted into the major, because oftentimes this is a limited enrollment program, meaning that not everybody gets to be a major. You have to make your bones first, as it were. You have to prove that you're able to survive the major. So these 100 level courses oftentimes are designed to weed people out. They're designed to be hard. They have strange rules that you have to follow in order to ensure that only the top of the top actually pass the courses. I actually had occasion to talk to the director of the computer science program at Michigan State just recently, and he specifically said, we're setting up students to cheat in the way that we teach the courses here by saying that there's these ridiculous requirements and you have to follow them in order to pass. But we're not going to change that because they serve their purpose in limiting the total enrollment in the major. Once again, consider the four areas right there. Who's targeted when we talk about, oh, there's all this cheating in computer science? Who's supposed to be monitoring for violations there? Who's supposed to be protecting and ensuring that they don't happen? In this case, are they trying to ensure that they don't happen, or is it in fact the opposite? And finally, who's responsible for punishing or acting on the violations? Okay, next up. Publish and perish or fraud. Oh crap. This is actually one that is near and dear to me because it's happening right now. There is a huge incentive to try to publish as much as you can out there as quickly as you can in order to gain tenure, in order to maintain your position as an academic, or just to ensure that you maintain your employment. Many universities have quotas for how much professors are supposed to publish every year, and oftentimes they will take into account what kind of journals you're publishing in when they're thinking, did you actually publish in good things? Um, but really, right now, we're seeing this in live time because everything that happens in regards to the chloroquine supposed cure for COVID 19, this is based on the faulty work of a French academic named Didier Raoult, who is known to have falsified his work multiple times. Uh, the journal article that so many people are using as a basis for saying that, oh, yes, this works and we need to get this out there for everybody, has been patently shown to be false. And I've included a link right here that shows what all the problems are in this particular study. This is something that's been ongoing for a long time. Academics have to publish a ton of stuff, and you know what? A lot of it might just kind of not really be real. John Ioannidis has done a lot of work with this. He's one of the people behind the famous reproduction studies, trying to look at psychology papers over the last several years and saying, hey, what percentage of the results can we actually duplicate in our reviewed studies here? Finding that it's less than 50% of the studies that are published out there that can actually be duplicated using the data. Um, a word here about China and the fact that up until just recently, and when I say just recently, I mean this last year, the Chinese government was very clear in saying that you must publish, 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 publish if you hope to get any money at all from the government and continue your program. So there was an incentive to cheat out there, that is to say, to falsify papers and just get whatever you can published out there. Um, so, once again, consider here what's going on. Do people get punished for this? Do people lose their jobs if they publish a false article out there? Matter of fact, if an article is retracted, if it's been actually taken out of the journals, do you ever hear about it? Do people actually say, like, oh, well, that's a, smirch on your reputation right there? Or does it even have any effect at all? And the fact of the matter is, it generally does not. Self plagiarism is widely accepted in academic journals. Um, just kind of sausage slicing or taking one study and publishing pieces of it in multiple journals is another accepted tactic among a lot of different people. Um, as an aside, right here, you've talked a little bit about Bell's list, I understand. What happened to Bell? Well, he was sued and he was fired because the universities did not want to deal with all the repercussions that would come from outing so many predatory journals right there. A lot of the predatory journals are doing just fine right now. People aren't calling them out. Think about this, though, in comparison. You, as a graduate student, if you were to submit the same work in two courses without permission from both instructors, that would be grounds for your immediate dismissal from the University of Maryland. No second chances, no nothing. Boom, gone. But a professor can do that as much as they want in papers, and no one bats an eyelid. Finally, so full of TOEFL. This is a case that happened just recently. Right about the same time that the Varsity Blues scandal was going on, there was a cheating ring that was busted in LA that was basically helping people get a passing score on the TOEFL, even though they might not speak English all that well or at all. I've included a link right here. This is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. In fact, a couple of years ago it happened up in Pennsylvania, and it was the same deal. But the thing about this is, universities constantly require very high scores on the TOEFL in order for students to actually be accepted as students at those universities. But they also play around with it. First of all, they create this very high stakes test situation where you have to get above 100 in order to be accepted as a student here. But oftentimes they'll also create an institutional incentive to cheat in different ways. Hey, you know what? Maybe you didn't pass the TOEFL, but if you come to our bridging program right here and promise that you will spend at least 1 year studying English, you know what? We'll let you take some electives along the way, and no matter what scores you get in that program, you're going to be a student at the end of it. So even if you still don't speak English, you know what? You can come on into the university. Um, and there's no institutional responsibility that's brought up in this case. Okay, dropping that. Once again, 4 areas that can create a framework that we can use to analyze academic integrity out there. Who's targeted by this particular situation we're looking at, what the violation might be, or however the situation is framed. Who's supposed to be monitoring and catching these things? Who's supposed to be protecting and making sure that this doesn't happen? And who's supposed to be acting on all this stuff? And once again, who's absent in each of these cases? That's basically all I got. Hope that we can have a discussion about these things. That's my email address. That's my Twitter handle. And I will have references on the next slide, and you'll see them underneath the video right here. I look forward to meeting you. There's the references. Thank you, and good night.